different, but George VIII. Ето малко. Добър ден, уважаеми зрители на телевизия BBR. Ние сме отново на гости на адвокатска кантора George VIII, където сме на среща с Мария Янакиева и господин Пол Луис. За да говорим този път за злополуките, които се случват по време на работа, злополуки, които имаме, когато сме на улицата или в някаква фирма, в шопинг център. Какви са нещата, които трябва да знаем за тях? Добър ден! This time we want to discuss the injuries which some people may occur during a work, especially most of the Bulgarians, they are working building sites, and most of them are self-employed. We want to find what shall we do if we have accident, and especially if it's not our fault, because quite often they ask us to do something, they don't provide the right equipment, and we go and do it because we want to earn the money. What you can advise in these cases if someone had an accident?
I think what's extremely important with regard to a work accident is to make sure you report the accident. Often claims will come through and the client's been injured, and we say to the client, did you tell your employer or did you tell the contractor that you were injured? And they say no. And the accident was 3 months ago. And that makes it very difficult to prove that the injury occurred whilst you were working. So if you have an accident at work, and the same applies if you have an accident in a public place, like a shopping centre or a leisure centre or something like that. If you have the accident, make sure you report it to someone. If you have the accident at work, you must report it to your employer, or if you're self-employed, say on a building site or something like that, make sure you report it to the contractor. Very important, work accidents have to be placed in the accident book. Now, depending upon how efficient your employer is, there may not be an accident book. There should always be an accident book for every employer. It's part of the health and safety laws in the UK. So you must always ask your employer to make a record of the injury that you've suffered, and that makes bringing a claim subsequently easier. If you have an accident in a leisure centre or a shopping mall or something like that, make sure you're reporting the accident to the owners or the operators, and make sure they're taking full details of both you, of the injury that you suffered, and exactly how the injury took place. If it's at all possible, try and take some photographs of how the injury occurred. That's not always easy, yes, but most people have mobile phones these days. Most people have cameras on their mobile phones these days. So if you've had an accident and you've suffered an injury anywhere, insofar as possible, try and take some photographs of what it is you tripped over, or you fell on, or you cut yourself with, or something of that nature. Because when you report the accident to the employer, the contractor, or the leisure centre, for example, they may immediately rectify the problem. If it's a paving stone on the street or something like that, or a piece of machinery in a factory or on a farm, they may immediately repair that or replace it if it's faulty. And once that evidence is gone, it can sometimes be quite difficult to prove what it is you're saying.
If the accident is more serious, then the ambulance will be involved. They can help you with the information in case if you don't report it. If they come, probably they can record some information. This is useful. But if it's a small accident, sometimes ankle and something small, then, and if the company doesn't have record books, especially if you work for a subcontractor with 5 people, and how you can report it. If you send the email to the company, can you use this as a report? Email stating all the information?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. That doesn't normally happen, but actually that would be an excellent idea. If you've got a small employer, one who's not particularly good at abiding by rules and that sort of thing, and that often applies to building sites, yes, and this kind of environment. If you can prove in some way that you've reported the accident, that's going to be very helpful. An email or a letter or a text message even, something that you're able to provide the solicitor with a copy of, is always going to make life easier if you subsequently wish to make a claim.
And quite often, I mean, if you have a small accident, you're afraid. It doesn't matter where you work or what you work, you're afraid, oh, if I go and claim it, report it, I may lose my job. How long you got before you can record this accident, not just record, but raise a claim, how many months or years after?
Well, the general rule is 3 years. 3 years from the date of knowledge of the injury, and that's almost always the date of the accident. The reason why you have 3 years is because it's not always immediately apparent that an injury has been suffered. Sometimes, if you work for the employer, you might fear for your employment, and it's fair to say that if, as a builder working for a subcontractor on a building site, sometimes if you make a claim against the contractor, he will find a reason not to hire you. That's life. It sometimes happens. You should make the claim as soon as possible. Whilst you have 3 years to make the claim, the longer you leave it, the more difficult it is to make. So I would always advise people to make the claim as early as possible. If you have an accident 2 years ago, and then you change your job, and then you think, I'm going to make the claim now. No. If you're trying to make a claim 2 years after it's happened, you're going to have some obvious difficulties. Trying to prove how it happened, something you may have tripped over or hurt yourself on, is probably not still going to be there 2 years afterwards. Any witnesses that might have existed, any fellow employees or something of that nature, may not be around, their memories might fade. So the general rule is you need to make the claim as early as possible, but you do need to weigh up, you need to balance making the claim against any risk it might have for your employment or your contract.
Is there a difference when you work as employed and self-employed when you do a claim? Because most of the people think, oh, I'm self-employed, maybe I cannot get anything, there's no point reporting this, I'm going to get better in a few weeks.
The employment position is irrelevant. It doesn't make any difference whether you're employed or self-employed. The issue is, have you suffered an injury because of somebody else's negligence? Now, negligence would be generally defined as failing to do something that you should do or doing something that you shouldn't. So as an employer with a piece of machinery, the employer will be responsible for making sure you've got safety equipment when necessary, making sure there are guards on the piece of machinery that you're working with, and making sure that you're properly educated and properly trained to use that equipment. Whether you're employed or self-employed, if you're self-employed and you're contracted to a larger company or an organisation, they have the same responsibilities to make sure that you're properly trained, that the equipment they're giving you is safe, and that you've got the appropriate safety equipment as well. So there's no specific difference between employed and self-employed. The rules still apply equally.
For everyone. Да включим малко и Мария в разговора. Работите с българи, с поляци, с доста такива източноевропейци, които са в construction site. Много от контрактите, които се печелят в Великобритания заради по-ниските цени, които често са причина за това, че се спестяват средства за protection. Според законите, когато работиш на височина на дадени метри, винаги трябва да имаш скели. Много често хората използват стълби и са принудени. Дошъл е човек да работи тук, трябва да изкара пари. Ти карате да направиш тази работа, съгласяваш се, нямаш избор, иначе трябва да си ходиш обратно. В такива случаи какво става? Сигурно има такива някои случаи, които се попадава пак с хората.
Да, има случаи, в които хората са принудени да използват съоръжения, която не е съобразена и не подсигурява тяхната безопасност на труд. В този случай и във всеки случай, в който сте убеден, че вашият работодател не е направил всичко възможно, за да обезопаси вашата работа, вие трябва да се обърнете към адвокат, да потърсите помощ и да повдигнете иск срещу човека, който е проявил небрежност и поради чиято небрежност вие сте жертва на инцидент. Това може да бъде на работното место, може да бъде и на обществено място. Но да, много често случва се, инцидент се е случил на работното место, тъй като работодателят е искал да се приключи работа по-бързо, не е предоставил необходимата екипировка или са използвали съоръжения, които не са съобразни и тогава се случват инциденти. Важно е, както отбеляза Пол, да се съобщи за този инцидент колкото се може по-бързо, за да може да се отбележи в книга за инциденти, да се съобщи на отговорно лице, което се намира на място и да се обърнем за помощ след това за правна помощ, колкото се може по-скоро, тъй като имаме по-голям шанс да спечелим случая си. Този случай, да.
А ако вината е ваша, в смисъл работодател е предоставил дадени екипировка, вие сте решили да не ги използвате, тогава човек какво може да направи? Понеже ти загубваш време, не може да работиш, дали човек може да потърси, пак да се свърли. По някой път не е ясно дали е твоя точно вината, не може да се докаже.
Да, точно поради тази причина бих съветвала да се свържат отново с нас, тъй като понякога има аспекти, които човек не вижда или не взема предвид. Ние бихме могли да ви кажем дали имате възможност да направите иск и какъв е шансът за успеваемост.
При такива случаи отново наблягаме на self-employed, хората, които не получават никакви болнични, когато не са на работа, нямат никакви застраховки допълнителни, които да ги покриват, ако останат без работа. Има ли застраховки, които се заслужава човек, когато си self-employed, да вземеш някаква застраховка, която би ти помогна в такива случаи допълнително?
Може би този въпрос трябва да го отправим към Пол.
We're talking about if you work as a self-employed and you have accidents, there are two cases. One, you've got some protection insurance against accident, sickness. The other one, you don't have. Is it a good idea to have some extra insurance? Can it help? Because some people, they don't know about this type of insurance. They don't have anything, and then you're self-employed, you're without work, you cannot claim maybe.
If you can afford protection of that kind, yes, it's very important because you're only going to be able to make a claim if you suffer an injury that was caused by someone else. Many injuries are caused to people that work both employed and self-employed every day that's their own fault. I suspect the majority of injuries that people suffer are probably caused by something they've done themselves rather than anybody else's fault. So unless you've been injured because of somebody else's negligence, you can't make a claim for compensation. But if you're self-employed and the injury prevents you from working, you may have a family to feed, you may have rent or a mortgage to pay, you're going to have bills and responsibilities. So some form of financial protection I think is always important if you can afford to do that. And I'd always suggest that's distinct and separate from whether or not you're likely to suffer an injury you can make a claim for. As with all insurance, it's a question of whether you can afford to pay premiums in return for the protection that you're looking for. Some people don't believe in that kind of insurance and they're happy to save their money on the premiums and run with no insurance at all. Other people, like me, tend to insure everything and run up a fortune in premiums each month. But it's really a question of what you can afford and what protection you want.
Да се върнем отново на Мария, значи ако трябва да прави клейм, човек работи на същия принцип, както застраховките за коли, не плащате нищо предварително и вие решавате дали ще се продължи, ако се продължи пак. Не ви пречи по никакъв начин да опитвате да се свържете с вас хората и да пробват.
Да, точно така. За съвет.
Да, съвет.
Не таксуваме своите клиенти и ако вашият случай не спечели, то тогава вие не заплащате нищо на своя адвокат. Ако случаят е печеливш, тогава при получаване на компенсацията заплащате и адвокатска такса. Единствените случаи, при които искам да отбележа това, е възможно да се заплати в случай, че делото ви е загубено, ако вие умишлено сте изоблачили истината и сте предоставили фактите по този начин, че те да са във ваша полза, т.е. когато сте излъгали.
Значи съвет е, по принцип знам, че на адвокат може да се казва всичко и би трябвало да каже човек всичко, да не се притеснява. Не трябва да има тайни между клиента, вие като адвокати ще запазите неговата тайна. Затова е по-добре, за да няма изненади накрая да се окаже, че трябва да плащате нещо, което не ви се иска. По-добре да кажете всичко.
Да бъдете откровени с своя адвокат, за да може той да ви представлява по най-добрия начин.
Can you tell about some cases, I mean, recently or the past, some interesting cases where some people didn't realize there is a big problem, but they didn't expect something to be paid for them and they ended up with some extra money, especially cases when you are on the roads, shopping centers, even at work, because this is the thing that people would think, oh, next time if they have accident, they would think, oh, I can end up with some amount of money after this.
Sometimes there can be cases where people are injured and they put it down to just one of those things. I guess employer-related injuries are perhaps a good example. The employee doesn't perhaps fully understand the responsibilities the employer has to keep them safe. So there's a responsibility, as I said earlier, to provide a safe place of work. There's also a responsibility to provide equipment to keep you safe as well. There are all manner of regulations involving how somebody might work on a building site or in a warehouse. There are regulations dealing with the amounts of weight that a single person is able to lift. There are regulations dealing with working at certain heights. So perhaps in warehousing or something of that nature, when you're working above your head height, when you're working with ladders, when you're working with fluids of some kind, where slip injuries will often occur. So it's a question really that I would suggest that if you suffered any injury anywhere, it's worth a telephone call or an email inquiry. I regularly receive email inquiries or telephone calls where people say to me, "Can I do this?" And I'll say, "Actually, yes, you can." "Well, I didn't think I could. I thought it was worth asking." So there must be many people who don't bother to ask the question. Just put it down to one of those things, or it's probably my fault anyway,
Yes.
or the employer probably isn't responsible for dealing with this. Well, the health and safety laws on employers are very onerous. They're very considerable. And as a general rule, unless you've done something really, really stupid,